Hello. Hola. This is strong. But thanks for coming. And thanks for the invitation of Council of Garage. As it was said, please interrupt if you need. We might be, I don't know, getting too abstract or unclear. It's always a bit tricky to raise the hand, but really do it, please. We'll be just introducing very briefly some of the ideas and practices that we'll be using for this, let's call it a piece, that is called the Misreader's Guide to Listening, that will be in preparation in May and opening during Infinite Ear. And what we're just going to do is to go back to the origin of this project. I think it started 3 years ago, when Valentina and I started the conversation about, let's say, our shared practices. We both have a dance background, I think it was said. I think maybe we can stop a little bit on this dance background. I'm going to talk for myself, and you can say if I'm wrong or if... but let's say I relate to dance as a sensing, perceptive, kinesthetic knowledge. I was a very, very happy student, learning that I call it a knowledge because I was discovering that sensing, perceiving is not taken for granted. You actually learn to do it. You can play with it, you can expand it, transform it, shift it. So it really becomes a tool that has a very strong transformative potential. So I think this is what dance was for me, a medium to discover new forms of sensoriality. I don't know if sensoriality makes sense, but does it? Yeah, okay. So yeah, I think what we also shared was that this knowledge, we would relate to our work more as a tool than as pieces.
Yeah, at the time we were already working on one-to-one practices. Yeah. Or thinking of the work we do as a practice, as something that has to be done and done again. And that's how we met. Myriam was doing these walks. She brings people for walks with eyes closed. And I went to one of them, and then we started to talk. And we really wanted to learn each other's practice. So we wanted to learn, what do you do? What is it? What can we know from this? And in this sense, this is for me is a shared understanding. So also me in the training of dance, the most interesting part was the studio. So the possibility to be in the studio and really learn. So there is an element of knowledge through sensation and to practicing with each other and to what you can make and think and really learn. And there is the possibility of learning like abstractly or conceptually through sensation. So of course we started to talk, and that's been a conversation that is still ongoing. And we learn each other practices out of interest. So Myriam, so you want to talk about your practices?
Yeah, I think there was this thing of learning, and also that sensations can become a vector to imagine new forms of relationship. So how you engage not only with your own sensation, but how it becomes a way to engage with others, and also with, let's say, all the elements that compose your environments. So yeah, this is basically what I'm trying to do. So use the different forms of sensing and to produce relationships and avoid the context of representation, let's say. So it's dance without the mediation of an image.
And so we started to share. I shared with Myriam the practice of fake therapy, which is a healing technique that does not need any expertise. And it's a set of, very concretely, it's a set of cards that anybody can use to heal anybody else. And I also shared with Myriam the political therapy that is using that healing technique, so that touch, in order to talk about political problems. and beginning to think from sensation. So being able to link the sensation that you might feel during a treatment to abstract political questions, with the possibility of thinking together through intimacy and touch, and really using critical thinking to connect it with the body.
And so I shared with Vale this practice that I have, which is a walking practice, basically, where I propose to someone to go out in the city, any part of the city, and to close the eyes. So there's a specific form of touch that enables to create support and connection between the person with the eyes closed and you with the eyes open. And during this walk, I propose to the person to open the eyes in the moment of a flash on images that are just extracted in the moment in the city. And I also shared that it's like a nap practice where the person is invited to lie down in an indoor space, put in darkness, and there are objects of different fabrics, weights, textures, sound that are activated on the body lying down, with the idea that the person would not be able to identify my gesture on the object. So basically what is touching her is the properties of the material itself.
And so we were like, great, I could take a political problem and bring it for a walk, and then maybe have a nap with it, and then we talk about it.
Or the problem could become a texture, or have a weight, or a temperature.
And we just talk about the problem through the object. So we started to mix the practices and see what if we do not consider it our own, our authorship, and this is my piece and you cannot touch it, but what if I could take a little bit of this? And we started to think of this idea that we could use them as tools for treatments, and really thinking of treatment as a process. So the way you would treat leather, for example. So you pass it through water, then you do, so you go for a walk, you talk about it. And we started to think about it.
And we went swimming because we needed water as an element. And we discovered this amazing swimming pool in the suburbs of Paris. So we ended up thinking that maybe we could do this mixing, sharing of practices in this public swimming pool and stay with the swimming pool open. So with users, the staff, the kids playing, everything was in place, and we just try to infiltrate this space that is also about how we care for our bodies and how we take different quality of time. And we invited 6 other artist friends dealing with the same questions, mostly coming from dance as well, mostly working on this idea of relationship. And we ended up creating a little school with all those people, and each of us shared our specific practices, so that it all became tools available for all the group of La Piscine.
So there were people who work with herbs and herbal healing, so they had plants, so we had a little bar, there was an audio guide with questions, and
Shiatsu also has a practice.
Tarot reading. And
poetry books.
Yeah, so everybody brought any kind of material and practice that they use, and we would learn it from each other, and then we would be in this pool, and then people would come and they would...
Maybe we can show the pictures while we talk, so you have an idea of the space.
So people would come for an appointment, and they would meet one of us, and we would see where to start. We would offer this treatment that it could begin from a question, or we could go for a swim and then have a drink and then talk about the plants and the property of the plants, and then we would go for a walk. So depending on the meeting with the person.
And also the quality of the question. I think what we were trying to do is really work on the practices as what kind of properties they have, what kind of relationship they create, what's the quality of time they produce, and how we could somehow compose a sequence that could tune to the question, feed the question, treat the question. And everything became a kind of resource. Also the space, water becomes a resource. You see, like, so this, all the pictures you're seeing right now are happening in this public swimming pool. And yeah.
And that's when Gregory and Sandra came to do a treatment. And then they invited us for Infinite Year that took place in Bergen for the first time. And in the exhibition there was the work of Tarek Katoui, and that made all these instruments, the work with vibration. And for that occasion we invited Lendl to join us. Hello, Lendl.
Hey.
Hi, Lendl. And maybe we can just say that so there was this focus on listening, and we met Robert Demeter, who was a local deaf artist from Bergen. And we shared the same methodology that had been developed during La Piscine with him, so he appropriated through his own mode of perception the practices that we were bringing with us. So he was also participating, welcoming visitors in Bergen.
And similarly, Myriam and Valentina also shared with me the practices of La Piscine, so I could join them on this project in Bergen. And I was also involved in Bergen in a different way simultaneously, because I'm a researcher in sound. I'm a sound student, I guess, as you say. And I had a text. I was dealing with notions of unsound, which effectively are regions of the sonic, regions of sound that are beyond, let's say, our sensitivities. So that could be very low vibrations that we don't hear as sound, very high vibrations, very soft vibrations. There are many different sensitivities, and everyone has their own sensitivities. So there's a large gradient of capacities. There's different abilities. So I was dealing on notions of unsound, which are trying to track these thresholds of audibility already, and trying to find ways to mix this research, this theoretical research, with practical researches and kind of bodily practices to mix with Myriam and Valentina for these. And I think as a result, because the piece was now placed within a sonic context of Bergen and this project of Council of the Infinite Ear, the sonic was more amplified in the projects. And just as an example, I want to go through different modes of listening, because we were dealing with listening in a very extended sense, and not in the narrow kind of normative senses that it's usually treated. So for example, there's visual listening, which is, for example, you can see a rhythm, or maybe you can see a waveform, and that will tell you a lot about the quality of a sound. You know, if you see clothing moving because of a sound, you know, you'll probably assume that it's a quite loud sound. There are haptic forms of listening. You can feel sound. What else? There's the more, let's say, standard way of thinking through listening or sound, you could call cochlear listening. So the cochlea is a bone in your ear. So cochlear listening would be, let's say, listening just through the ear, as opposed to the body, as opposed through via the eyes. There's imaginary forms of listening where you could maybe pose the question, what does the world spinning sound like? To use an example from Yoko Ono. There are diagnostic forms of listening, which that would be when you hear, let's say, you hear a dog bark and you think, oh, that's a dog, or there are sounds at intersections that signal to people, you know, you can walk in this direction, traffic is flowing in this direction. So diagnostic listening would be sound as a signal, sound as what is that sound, and you're trying to figure out what that is, or it means something to you in a very particular way. Should I do the others, I guess?
Yeah.
Is that too many? No?
All the other forms.
I mean, there's many, many forms of listening. I'm just doing a couple. There's many more forms than this. There's prosthetic listening also, where you use something else as a mediator for your own listening. So that could come in the form of even a record. Let's say if you have a vinyl, you're listening to the piece via a prosthetic, via the turntable, the tone arm, all these other intermediary phases. It also works with if you have a cochlear implant. That prosthetic allows you to hear sound, and there's actually Council has done a lot of research on these kind of prosthetic forms of listening as well as the other ones, but there's a lot of really good material coming from Council on prosthetic listening. There's this one's quite interesting, which is niche listening or niche-based listening. So it's maybe a bit abstract, but this is again about the different types and different kinds of sensitivity. So different animals, let's say, have different sensitivities and different bandwidths of sound with which they are sensitive to or not sensitive to. So one way of thinking about a sonic niche is for humans generally, with cochlear listening, our cochlear are more sensitive to verbal speech, the bandwidth of speech. That's just with cochlear listening. Not with haptic listening. Our bodies, different parts of our bodies, are attuned to different frequencies. So different parts of our bodies will shake at different rates. So sonic niching is the specific bandwidths that sensitivities happen within as a mode of listening. And one that I personally really like is background listening. Usually people might just call this hearing, but effectively, if by calling hearing background listening, it's to say that even, let's say, music or forms of sound that are happening in the background, like the fan that's happening in the background here, you can attend to this even subconsciously, or little vibrations that are happening in your body. You can attend to this as a form of listening, as a mode of listening, even though it's in the background. So you don't. It's not. Listening doesn't necessarily mean you're attending to it very directly. That you're narrowing your, broad field of hearing, visual listening, all this stuff, to just a single point, to just a single bandwidth or this kind of thing. It also brings in then another mode of listening, and maybe I'll stop with this one, which is fictional modes of listening. So you can propose alternative ways of listening that maybe don't exist yet. There are Afrofuturists that are working on these modes of listening, so maybe you generate a new form of making sound, and then you can imagine, like before with the imaginary listening, ways of listening, but you can also fictionalize modes that maybe are completely impossible, maybe that don't have sounds, and you can imagine them as ways of fictionalizing what sound can be and what they still can be, or maybe have been. There's a lot of historians working on sound that have to enter these modes in order to imagine what, let's say, London or something like this sounded in the 18th century. And there's a lot of research actually happening in trying to, and it's fiction in one sense because you have to use all these documented materials to re-describe these sounds, but you also have to really fictionalize because you don't know exactly what a horse might have sounded like when it was, going around London.
On a different floor.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this also brings us back to those very active or embodied modes of imagination. and our reference to reading. And so because this possibility of listening by not taking it for granted as a single normative mode, but taking vibration, taking all sorts of these different forms of listening, and allows us to work on the ways in which we can. I mean, I was thinking about the possibility that listening, it's, of course, something we do with our whole body, and it's a specific vantage point. So depending on what you're focusing on, or depending on the mode of listening that you employ, or the kind of practice of listening that you enter to, you're going to be able to compose a different kind of image, or a different kind of understanding of what's going on. And that is why we had this invitation to have guides that would be active readers and misreaders through listening.
Well, maybe the miss was also this idea that we didn't, to destabilize a little bit, this idea that there would be a correct way of listening. As Lendl just said, like there's so many different ways, and the miss has this potential of maybe not understanding or producing different forms of understanding that we might not know of yet, or
and enter that fictional capacity of an experience.
So it's like the miss is a trigger for activating this imaginary activity, which is actually not a fantasy, but maybe like things to take very seriously, that there are other modes. And this could also produce different modes of, we were talking about sociality, like the way we relate to one another, the way we relate to space. Like, for example, to go back to Robert Demeter that we met in Bergen during this, we call it blind walk, but actually it's not a good way. It's just a closed eyes walk. Normally, for people who hear, it's very big, the perception of sound. It's like an amplifier. It functions a bit like a microphone. So for Robert, everything became more about the volumes of space, the way he would relate to floor, the way he relate to the variation of rhythm. So a lot of things were happening.
The way he composed the images as a poem.
Yeah.
And so it became clear that that's a vantage point. And the points of, again, to share the practice and bring the practice and use it again and use it, having it used by different people, it's the possibility of developing the practice in other ways. Let it do different kinds of things from what it was intended originally.
And things that we have no idea of. So this would be also this invitation for people to come and share what they do, how they perceive, so that the work is still in process of learning, transforming,
And those practices, or this mode of engaging, it generates an encounter, basically. Either a one-to-one encounter or an encounter with a small group of people. And that encounter, because you engage it through experience and you go through something together, it's a very intimate mode, but an intimacy that is not founded on affection. I know you, you're my friend, I like you, let's go and listen to the waves or look at the panorama. But it's a very immediate kind of intimacy and a developing of a certain kind of empathy and a way of being together that we would like to explore. This brings also in what we would like to do here, and that is an experiment to continue this process of mixing practices, and that would be to work in May for a couple of weeks with the guides, and thinking that the guides could be people who have an interest in those kind of experiences or research or explorations, and that would have their own expertise and practice that they bring to the space. And to do again what we did with each other, so sharing all the practices we have available as much as possible, and then having each guide figure out what is the way in which they want to engage, and what is the way in which, what kind of guiding explorations, how can they even work with their practice, through our practices, and this we don't know because we never tried, so this would be an experiment, and it would be also, maybe new practices will emerge. Maybe there's going to be a whole set of other works that are going to begin from that.
But it's basically trying to create a space for cooperation more than us bringing the piece. I think there was this thing of Morley?
Oh,
Moiré, not Morley, Moiré.
Yeah, well, that's just to emphasize the, let's say, the intersections of the different practices that we share and we will share. Because even in the kind of, like already in kind of your invitation of me at Bergen, let's say, there was a lot of intermixing of practices already and making things a little bit more sonic, as I was saying a little bit previously. And with this project here, with the kind of open call for an invitation for guides, there's something that comes up and comes out only in the relation of other practices with the practices that we already have, and in learning the practices. And you know, it's not that, I mean, everyone has their expertise, and you can't necessarily give someone else an expertise. That's not what we're asking for, or what this project is necessarily about, but it's in the way that you, let's say, misread the expertise in it being transmitted to you or shared with you. You know, the way that I take up the closed-eyed walk, you know, my touch is going to be different than Myriam, who's done it for quite a while. Not just because of the time that she's done it for, but just the way that we are, you know, the way that we will touch in these kinds of things. So
and also
there's a kind of interference, which is a kind of productive interference, actually.
Because you need that interference for phenomena to appear, basically. If you didn't have it, it would be...
it almost only exists in the relation.
It only exists in the relation, exactly.
So it's not about we have to learn all the practices and then we have to be very, you know, good, because maybe some of the guides will have a lot of experience with touch, but others going to be an amazing astrology reader, and somebody knows about plants, and it doesn't mean that everybody has to know the same things and then kind of repeat it and perform it. But there is new ways of understanding, misunderstanding and understanding when you put different practices just next to each other, and a new image develops, or another understanding even of the space. And in this context, we will be inside an exhibition, so there's going to be films and instruments, there's going to be sound, there's going to be vibration, there's going to be also two other exhibitions.
So the space of the museum itself?
So the old space of the museum, the space of the park, maybe. And so this means that that's going to be our environment to sense. And to sense and to make sense of. So there is this double ways, that the ways in which we go about sensing the environment around us proposes different way of making sense of it. So there are many different possible entries for people to develop, also their interest, the research, the work. And I don't know, personally, this is also a desire for me not to do work as that becomes an object and then is showed and then is repeated, and then, but to let it as something that is alive and that is going to teach me something, because otherwise I get bored with it. And so you're invited. And if you have any questions or thoughts.
Maybe you can tell something about the process of what you said for the group that will be prepared for the exhibition and working. What will be the process? Or it will be some experience that you can't now explain?
Well, tomorrow we do a workshop from 11 to 6, And it's going to be a first moment to introduce some of these practices, to have, beyond describing them in language, but to have an experience of them. And I guess the work in May, it's going to be really practicing and then working individually with each guide to figure out what the possible approach is. And then there's going to be the moment where the exhibition opens, but that's just the beginning moment, because it's not that, that's going to, being a practice, it develops as it happens.
You're not supposed to be ready or done. It's all about never being done.
You just need an hypothesis to begin.
But maybe the process is also an association system, where you start sharing something and then it makes you think of something to bring, and then it's really the sequencing process. It's basically how we worked also when we did it 3 years ago. We did this, it was super tonic, it was about, this specific mode of having a conversation, maybe now we need to take it down. It's about really tuning to the different qualities of what each of us bring. But we can't know what the plan will be before we meet. It's really this thing of encountering. We encounter through those things we do.
Hello. How do you check up the quality of the practice which another guy is doing? For example, during the exhibition or something like it?
Each practices will be shared.
Share, and then
during
the guys
the workshop
who learn it, do you check up quality of this practice? Maybe they're doing something wrong.
It's hard to do something wrong.
But it's possible.
So it starts with nothing is wrong. No.
No, there is the only thing you can do wrong is that so there is gonna be all the ways in which we are gonna work on how to approach people, what is this exchange, and what consent is. Because if you're it's terrible for people to go, look at me, now we're gonna clap our hands and close our eyes and feel, it's terrible. You don't want to put people to gather attention and do this. So we have to find ways in which there is a communication with the spectators and there is a moment of consent in which you have 15 minutes, okay, let's try the sound massage table, or let's do this other thing. And there is a clear communication that if at any time anything doesn't feel comfortable or safe, you just say it. And that's the only measure of when something is wrong. Otherwise, it's an exploration of what sensing is, what kind of knowledge it is, and
But it's true that it's practices that aim to create a space of support, a safe space. So maybe this would be one of the criteria.
Okay, thank you.
So давай я или там вопрос? So I'm gonna ask. There is also. So then first, then I.
Do you envision this as a therapeutic practice, as in this guiding? Is it supposed to bring therapy or comfort, psychological comfort?
it might.
It might, yeah.
But I mean, like the misreading says, the project is very much open to misunderstandings and to the opaque zones between, different terms. Because that's not the promise. That's not, okay, come here. But a treatment is both a process, like what the example I was giving with leather, or a question, for example, okay, I really have this thing happening in my life and I need to think about it. And if I sit and think, it doesn't help. So, okay, let's bring it to the sound massage. Let's walk with it and let's do something. And maybe you don't even talk with each other, but the person is doing this process. You can also say, think of a problem you have and we're going to treat it. But it's, and that's why it's also about making sense. I think that also when you do a, let's say, real process of healing, you are engaged in different treatments. So you try to do different things with it. You think about it, you go to massage, you do this, you go to therapy, you talk to your parents, you do whatever you need to do, you go to the doctor, you do all sorts of things. And in those processes, at some point, you have a moment in which, you know, you feel better, or the pain, or the suffering,
transform.
Yeah, you have an insight. You have a moment in which that has a different meaning.
Yeah.
So even I think the therapy that promised real therapy cannot do that, because it's such a moment. So what we can offer is different kinds of processes, but it has not a therapeutic aim. But we can play with the fiction of it. Yeah. Like we can play with the fiction that we are reading the future. We can play with the fiction we read in the past, or we are in a different planet, or...
Thank you.
Спрошу. Yaroslav has a notion that I have to ask something in Russian. Oh, I'm sorry for... So I just ask a short question and then pass. Я попробую по-русски спросить. Это скорее связано с предыдущим вопросом.
So this is related to the previous question. I know that this girl who asked the question is a performer.
И, может быть, вопрос про
And
правильность
I
или
guess
неправильность,
she asked what's right, what's wrong, can be specified and changed. For example, where is the boundary between your art statement, between your art interest, as looking at you as three people, and the borderline with mediators? Do you identify this borderline, or you just withdraw from this? Are you going to keep this borderline between artists and mediators, or you just let it go?
This is very strange. Let's go on with it.
I don't know how it was translated, so...
No, but I think this is the border we will work on. In this sense, it's a group collaboration of also, whatever, 15, 20 people who are going to try to figure out what this is. Because maybe somebody makes something so amazing that it's better that they continue to do that than, you know, maybe they will not use the fake therapy or the walk, and they just do one thing and they do it over and over, and it's neither of our things, but it's going to continue. And I don't know, for me this is just, it's not like we made this piece and now we're going to teach it to somebody and somebody's going to perform it for two. I think this is also relevant, just question of the time, like how do you bring performance or these modes of activating an exhibition or performing in it without being totally alienating work, and also maintaining it a space in which you are still studying, you're still rehearsing, you're still trying to figure out things, and...
maybe a machine that generates new forms or new practices, no? So maybe, like, right? Maybe this walk creates another thing, and totally open to it.
There's no necessity for our specific gestures or practices to continue throughout the exhibition, let's say.
The only thing that has to continue is the shared interest in what the exhibition is about. So that if we are explore these modes of listening and what listening, sensing, and making sense, how do you guide people through this exhibition, what kind of sense and understanding or reading of the space can happen, then anyway is possible. Yeah. Of course, it cannot become totally about something else, but that is about to keep, you know, what we maintain a common and collective focus on what we are trying to do.
Tell us, please, how deaf people can take part in this process and how they're going to communicate with visitors and mediators.
I think, yeah, we have cards. We also need to invent ways to translate things that me as a hearing person, talking person, I use words, but there are, I think, ways to imagine new forms of communication. This is, for me personally, one of the main interests of this project. I have no idea what forms will be invented, but I'm very, very curious of how we can imagine together ways of doing it. To go back to Robert again, during this walk, there are words that need to be said normally. I mean, for a hearing speaking person, I use words that those words were translated into gestures. So when you need to say open, close the eyes, for example, it was a pressure of the hand. When you need to say that there is a step that goes down or up, we just went with the hand along the spine down and along the spine up. So that was one of the possibilities. And I think we can, use writing, use cards, use mediating objects. But I don't think that silence is a problem. I mean, there's really like so many different ways that I ignore.
I have a proposal. You're going to start your project tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
Tomorrow is just the...
Wait,
Should I share my proposal now? I need some time to formulate it. Give me some time, okay?
Yeah, da.
So raise your hands if you can't hear. I'm a dancer. I go to and participate in different battles. And when I come to different battles, there are sounds that I can see. But how can you understand this? The sound that you can see. I go back home, and one girl who was deaf asked her, "You can't hear anything?" No, she says, "I can't hear anything." But can you feel some music, some rhythm? Yes, I can feel something. So let me dance now, let me move around, and you'll share what music do you feel. And she says, something melodic. No, it's heavy music, so you can show this in your body movement. You can show the sound just through the dance.
Спасибо.
Are you going to be tomorrow here? Yes, but only in the evening.
I asked if he can join us tomorrow, and he says that unfortunately he cannot come in the morning, but it's okay if he comes for the second half.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Da.
Hello. Sorry
Hello.
for my bad English. No, okay. I have a lot of friends who have very big problems with touch of other people, and they are afraid they can't relax and they can't trust the other people. So, have you any problems with that, and how can you solve these problems in your investigation?
Yeah, I don't know. Through the years of practices that I've been going through, this problematic relation we have to touch can be completely respected. Like it's not something that should be pushed or forced to. For me, it's also trying to create again a safe space where you can negotiate trust. So you can test possibilities. And to go back to this idea that we don't know each other and we might not be able to touch each other, but we might also be. So for me, it's this question that comes back each time I meet someone. How can we? Or not? And if we can't, we can't. There is no way for me that I'm going to push that relation if it's not possible.
And that doesn't mean you cannot do anything.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
there are all these other tools. So things that we want to use, I don't know. And it depends, but for example, taste, herbs. There is the possibility of reading. I mean, I use tarot cards a lot. So there is the possibility of starting, for example, I read poems and cards to a question. So you can engage in ways that don't involve touch, but provoke a different reading or a different experience of listening without touch.
Thank you. It's very important for me. Thanks.
I don't know.
I also have a question about touch. I often see this, that hearing people do not feel the touch. For example, in the metro, because I'm an actor and I try to study different characters by observing people. Some people are totally absorbed in their gadgets, phones and things, and when I touch him accidentally, he is shaking and he doesn't hear me. Whereas if it's a deaf person, he responds quite differently, very fast to the touch. So deaf people are very good, have very good visual perception, whereas hearing people are not so well grounded in terms of visual perception.
Yeah, there's always a blind spot.
Yeah, I mean, this is why it's to keep it exciting, so this for me it's exciting to think of, okay, so how do we use that sensitivity to expand, because you already are gonna know something about the space that I am not sensitive to, and how do we make it accessible? So what kind of practice are you gonna bring me into the space to listen to this? Or when somebody is like, I'm never going to touch anybody in this piece because it's not the person but me as a guide, I don't want to engage with touch. But I'm writing a PhD thesis and I'm going to ask to every visitor the question that I'm asking my PhD, and I will see if by going through the exhibition they will be able to give me some information about this. And it's a purely theoretical research that's, like the capacity of things we could know and learn through working together, that's what's exciting to me.
Есть ли еще какие-то вопросы? Поднимайте руку.
This is a unique project, and I'm interested if you worked with deaf people before, or is this going to be your first project in Russia with the participation of deaf people? And how many deaf people participated in such projects before?
So Robert in Bergen, that we mentioned several times. For me, to be really honest, it's the first time in Moscow. I I just spent 3 days in Moscow for the first time. And no, this is new.
Скажите, пожалуйста, только Роберт, да, из неслышащих участвовал в вашем проекте, а кроме него были еще какие-то глухие участники в ваших проектах?
No, because we only did it in Bergen, and that was only for a week. And so that was the only experience was with Robert, really.
После этого вы решили этот проект сделать здесь, в Москве, с участием неслышащих людей.
It's part of the research of Tarek Atui and council to work with deafness in relation to sound, to say that deafness is not necessarily a privation of sound. I mean, I don't want to speak for council, the curator of this project, or the curators of this project, but I think their involvement with deaf people has been going on since about 2013. Is that correct?
Yeah. Maybe
Yeah. Well, but then I'll say our involvement after. So Gregory will talk about council and their work with deaf people, and then you'll see how our project gets located. Do you want to?
Yeah, but maybe I can. Hello, so I can introduce. So hello, I'm one of the 2 members of council, Gregory Castera, and basically we have no relation with the deaf community at the starting point. I have no people in my family with deaf or no friend with deaf, and basically the project started in 2013 when we were invited by a museum to work in a deaf center in the Emirates. So it's a very special invitation to do a workshop there. And we had, so, you know, this kind of situation that is very absurd, that you don't know people you will go to work with, but yeah, you try something and you will stay, or at the end maybe we will just learn something together. And we had this intuition to bring people who are dealing with sound, but in many different ways in this workshop. And little by little through the workshop, we realized that basically this idea that deafness is about a disability, about not hearing, all of these things were just totally broken, and we realized that all of this was wrong, totally outside of our common understanding, and that basically this idea that deafness is deaf people and hard of hearing people are differently able. The thing that it's a different ability, and there are many ways to be deaf, as there are many ways to be hearing, is maybe much more interesting. But of course, when we begin to think about it, that deafness and hard of hearing is also it's an expertise. It's a way to it's an expertise in perceiving sound, as when you have other abilities. Then how can you make an exhibition related to hearing? How can you think about the politics of hearing? How can you think about even scientifically speaking, what is hearing? So that was basically the starting of this project. If you basically give a seat in the table to deaf people, when you talk about all of these questions that usually are questions that only hearing people are talking about. And so we just began by working with this artist, Tarek Atwi, by doing sound instrument. And again, Tarek is not deaf, but in the way he was working, he was involving deaf and hard of hearing people in every step of the work and we didn't have any idea in our mind what could be this instrument, what could be the sound behind the music to be produced. It was really just an experiment. So we were involving them and we were making this instrument together. And so he did it a lot in many different art centers, a lot in United States, because as you know, in United States there is this Gallaudet University and there is a strong deaf community in United States. And then we had this chance to do this project in Bergen in Norway. And again, it's something you cannot like imagine in the beginning in your head, have a plan on it. We were thinking of what could be a space where basically this hearing norm are troubled, where as an hearing person, when you enter in the space, you realize that basically this norm is not so easy, and you are just one part in the spectrum among these many ways of hearing. And so what could be this space? And so that was what we tried to do in Bergen. So there was all of this sound instrument, there were many things, there was a movie theater, and we at some point we were conceiving, we were like, okay, we need to have practice. We need to have people who are doing things together. And this is how we engage the discussion with Valentina, Myriam, and Lendl. And it became little by little the equivalent of what we call the mediation in a museum. So the people, usually the mediator is the one who is in between the artwork and outside, the one who is introducing, explaining what is the artwork. So, and usually it's very strange because these people, it's never in the artistic project, in the curatorial project when we do an exhibition, but they are always there. They are in between, and they are there in the space. So what if we introduce, if we consider that the mediation is in the project itself, it's in the curatorial project itself. And so this is when we begin, and then through the discussion we are now here. And I have to say that in 2013 and even last year, I was not even thinking what could be this exhibition. And so it's really an experimentation that we do together. So maybe it replies to a few of the questions you have about basically how inclusive is the project and how we consider the relation to deaf people. But it's really like basically considering that the deafness is an expertise. And I have to say that it's not about helping. It's not. We don't consider that we are giving space. The space is taken by people. People take a space. We don't give space. We don't consider that we help people who need to be helped. We just consider that everyone has an expertise on hearing, and we just create a space for this. So that's it.
Yeah.
Да. Вот о ценности того, что ощущения самих неслышащих людей, об их ощущениях. Зачастую, что есть такие ощущения, когда человек и не слышит, да, и не видит. Вот он об этом хотел сказать, если можно. Я расскажу. Я могу выйти или с места рассказать, как лучше? Ну, чтобы, наверное, да, чтобы видела аудитория, лучше выйти сюда.
Вам удобно.
Да. То, что говорили ребята,
so
да, ощущение
the
передачи
guys
музыки,
shared,
движения.
the guys showed the movements and how they can show the sensations, but there are people that can't hear and can't see. They can't distinguish between different lights, so it will be very difficult for to explain what color is. The person that saw, that could see and then lost the vision, then this person still keeps some memories and knows what it's like to see different things. But for example, if there was a person who was blind from the birth, can I ask you to help me? So the person that can't hear and can't see, myself being an interpreter, I translate it by tactile methods, and so they can sense it through gestures or tactile alphabet or feel the hand. but they don't understand some signs, but still the person can perceive this information. And then when a person comes up to this person, he can recognize the person who came up to him. So he can remember the hand or the wrist of the person. Then he can touch the face and he memorizes this information. If I want to kid him and trick him and say I'm a different person and move differently, he won't recognize this person at first, but in a while he will identify a person. And then once he's misguided and I become to behave normally, he recognizes me for sure. So the people that can't see can play chess very well, and you know the chessboard is black and white, but black chess is higher than white chess figures, so they can hear the sound and identify the field where the chess goes. So, for example, I had chewing gum, and he thought I had a problem. He asked me if I had some difficulty because I kept chewing the gum. So when I tried to trick him and put my chess figure in the same place, he said, "Oh, you deceived me, you put it in the same place." So blind people can figure it out, even though we don't understand it. And so people perceive and see and feel differently.
Я задам все-таки свой вопрос. Меня больше
I have a technical question. I saw many people with earphones in your photos. Was it? Did they hear music, or what kind of experiment did you have? And then, as to hearing impaired people, do you use some acoustic system? How do you work with sound if you work with deaf people?
So what you saw with the it's let's say it's an audio guide which is made by a collection of questions that so you have this voice that asks you question as you walk freely in the space. It was a piece that was written in a city a few years ago, and that was rewritten for this swimming pool. The questions address your immediate situation, so basically what you see, what you hear, what you feel, and then they start to trigger your memory, and then they become more fictional. So it was more, it's a series of questions that tries to relate to different regime of mental regime simultaneously, let's say. We didn't use that piece in Bergen. It was really only done for this particular swimming pool. So of course, for someone who can't hear, we won't be proposing something to listen to. But I think all what Gregory was saying about Tarek's work was also to imagine instruments that could be perceived by deaf people. So it's all this work on, I'm not an expert, but on basically vibration that were perceived by deaf people. Yeah. If you don't speak, she can't hear.
Sorry.
I just wanted to make a comment. There's a description of our open call. So there is a more detailed description of the exhibition because it's going to, like the final product is going to be made within the exhibition. And this workshop is going to be part of the exhibition. Like now we are speaking about Tarek Atoui's musical instruments, and some of these instruments were created together with deaf people or some scientists and experts. And it's true that deaf people or hearing impaired people can reproduce the sound literally. And actually we are going to have a separate workshop related to that at the beginning of June. And then we are going to have two concerts at the beginning of the exhibition and at the end of the exhibition. And so you can come to this concert both as a participant if you are interested in playing those instruments or as a viewer. We are going to announce this later. But the mediation itself basically will involve some of the instruments.
That we have. И поэтому мы сейчас так заранее
начали встречаться с художниками, чтобы вы видели этих художников. An early meeting, and we wanted to have this meeting with the artists so that you could see them. And these practices are quite simple and straightforward, but it's very difficult to translate it into Russian language. And you know, when you don't see this, it sounds very abstract. But after we discussed it with the council and the artists, we decided to have this information session. And then tomorrow you will have a chance to stay with the artists. It's a special experience, and we are very happy that some of people already cooperated with us, because there's a collective experience that come about as a result of joint work, and it's difficult to describe in words, but it will remain in your body, and you remember the state you were in. So tomorrow we are going to have another day. If you forgot to register, please make sure and come to Katya, because the registration is closed. But if you came today and liked it, this idea, you can come and join us tomorrow. Then if you realize that this is something you really like, or your colleagues or your friends might like it, that do not know about it, we are having this open call until the 15th of May. So even if this person was not here today or is not going to come tomorrow, they can still send their applications. So sorry for this long comments, but we are going to update our information, make all the announcements and share the details.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, it's the shower. We have a cartoon where it is used like that. Есть вопросы? Пожалуйста, еще задавайте, спрашивайте.
Можно вопрос? Хотел, ну, конечно же,
Can I ask a question? So it's going to be just for one day, but I'm curious about the feedback from people that took part in this project. Are they ordinary people or performers or trained people? And what kind of response did they have? For example, when they got back to their normal life, what was different, for example? What did they feel? For example, people that were walking in the center of the city with their closed eyes, did they feel compassion with other people, or it was just fun? Because a person knows that he can see, but it was a very short period when he could not see, so maybe he now could feel this problem and sympathize with blind people that couldn't see. And then tomorrow's event, is it going to take place outside in the park, or where are you going to have it? I had an association with Russian bathhouse. It's like a sauna. Maybe several people can stay in a hot space, they feel the hot steam, then they run out to the street, and there's also water, but in a different state. So that's how they overcome the element and win over the element. So in the ordinary life, what happens to these people? Do they focus on these differences? Because the brain changes, right? And the person can feel it differently.
Не воспринимает.
Maybe you should clarify about the Banya first.
We answer about the bath? Yeah. Well, let's go to sauna. That's my only answer. No, I don't really know how to answer, but for sure the reactions are very, very, very diverse. Because it's this very singular, specific encounter, and what you bring with you. For some people it's very playful, for some people it becomes like a start of a healing process. For some people it's dramatic. For some people it's like an increase of empathy. There's a list of super diverse effects. I think some people bring them in their daily life, and it might have an impact on your daily perception. For some people it just dissolves. I don't have like a name, you know. It's like this, it might be healing.
But also, having an experience is knowledge. So when you don't give experience for granted, so the way our perception is organized, depending on, on your perceptual system, it's very functional. And what we can do is have less function-oriented ways of listening that are gonna concoct an experience that is specific. And then it's up to you, and maybe we put that experience with a question or with a card or with, some other elements so that this fictional experience, it's fictional because we composed it, but it's an experience and there is knowledge in it. But we don't know to begin with what is the knowledge we're going to transmit.
Просто хочется добавить, да, что завтра практическое
I
зрительство
just
художника будет в
wanted to
образовательном
add
центре,
that
тоже
we
в
are
парке
going to have
Горького, это другое наше
our
здание.
sessions with the artists in the education center. It's near here, and actually it looks like a bathhouse, just because it has a wooden floor. But in fact, it's a very nice place, a comfortable place with a warm atmosphere. So everybody who comes will stay there with artists. No cameras will be there. The artists will have some props like little cards, pillows, blankets. So there'll be different things happening there, and we're going to have this session from 11 to 2, and then there's a break, and then the work will continue from 3 to 6. So it's going to be a sort of workshop that we will have again later. At the end of May and at the beginning of June.
Да, и по прошествию open call и, возможно, по прошествию некого взаимодействия с художниками сегодня и завтра,
after this interaction with the artists and tomorrow's work, we'll identify the people who will continue to do things with us.
Можно много вопросов задавать.
Отлично. У меня два вопроса в таком случае.
I have two questions. I thought I had to ask just the last question, one question, but they let me ask two questions. So, as far as I understand, you want to have an experiment with deaf people. And it's clear what you're going to have, but what about deaf people? What will they get as a result of this? And the second question, the instruments that you used, for example, deaf people can use some hearing devices. Do you recommend to come with the hearing devices or without hearing devices?
I mean, the project is open to anybody who is interested in those questions, hearing or non-hearing, and in exploring what listening can be. So the part of what you get is whatever you bring in as your question, as your practice, as your interest in developing with us.
Yes, I'm sorry because I think it's also a question about the project in general, but what you take out of it, what you bring is first to build up a space with us that is not a space only for the deaf person, but a space where everyone is there, and when deaf person are not considered as a special group separated from the other, but when we try to be together and also stay singular at the same time. So that's, I would say, one answer. And I think from this process we can learn lots of things in the way everyone relates to hearing and to many other things. Basically, for now we have this idea of the mediation, all the misreading guide as exercise in perception. And if in the group we have the main part of the group will be people who are deaf or hard of hearing, of course it will have a huge influence on the whole project. And all of this, for example, the use of earphones, the use of speaking will be different. Everything will have to change because they will have to switch the way to work regarding the way deaf people and hard of hearing people are communicating and living. And so to answer to your second question about hearing device, do as you want. If you consider that the hearing device is just something to not suffer too much from living with hearing people, maybe you don't have to use it. You have to come as you are. If you like using an hearing device and if it's part of your life, come with it. As far as I have the feeling that this relation to hearing device depends on each person when you're deaf, and you're some certain people who play with it, basically. They turn it on and off all the time, and they have ways to deal with it. Do you think it's a good answer? Yeah.
So tomorrow you are going to do some practical work. It's clear about clothes, it has to be comfortable clothes. Should we bring some objects with us or not to take part in this practical session? And then somebody else tells him, you can bring whatever you want to bring. If you want to bring, you can bring it. So should they bring something? Do they have to bring something with them?
There's no need to bring objects. There is no need to bring objects for tomorrow. But I wasn't sure if I understood if you wanted to bring objects.
I mean, if there is any object that you think you should bring because you have an association or it's part of how you, whatever, for some reason you want to bring it, it makes sense to bring it, and we talk about it. And maybe also, I mean, if you read, because we also open the call also for readers of all kinds, healing. So if you have any of those practices and it's something that you can easily bring, yes, bring it. Actually, good idea.
I have a more specific question, if that's okay. I think you mentioned that you worked with poetry during your work in the swimming pool. And I'm a poet, so I'm interested in how did you integrate poetry into your communication practice in the swimming pool?
Well, the poetry comes from a set of poetry books that I always carry with me. It's contemporary American poets. And it's a friend who publishes this 500 places, and they really like the dimension of cards. So I carry them together with the cards and everything else, and I started to read a question. Somebody would come with a question, and with a card and a poem. And so we would make sense, like we would answer the question by reading together. We would read to each other the poem or look at the card. But during the La Piscine, for example, it has evolved. At some point we started to publish the poem on the body of the person. Or
play between this idea between publishing and embodying the poem. So the touch would be a way to help the embodiment so that you could address the body through the poem?
Or that the touch would be one way of reading the poem or translating the poem. So at the end, then in the encounter with the person, sometimes you would just start to play and invent something together. So that just comes from personal, curiosity, and you could bring in any other way.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? There's time only for one last question.
Maybe I'll also have a technical one. So I wanted to ask, how will you do interviews with those who want to join the team? Because I really love all this idea, and I love investigate guiding people to new experience through touch, for example. And I use nonverbal communication in my work, so I think I want to participate, but unfortunately in March I will be out of internet, so I'm a little bit worried how will those interviews.
Смотрите результат по open call. Срок open call отправки анкет до 15 марта,
so
а художники отвечают до 15 апреля.
Will be up to 15th of March. But you will reply until the 15th of April. So you'll get a response until before the 15th of April. If you don't have the internet, it's okay, because the artists, if the artists like your application, they will reply to you on the 1st of April or some other time. We take enough time to make sure we can have Skype interviews and other things. For example, if somebody doesn't feel comfortable to use Skype, maybe we could have an interview via email. Or do you speak English or not? How many people speak English here? Or shall we need some translation? But it's no problem. We'll help with that. It's not a problem.
No, I was just going to say that the process will simply be a conversation. So we'll find a way to have a conversation.
Let's thank our artists again.